Hi, folks. It's time for my yearly re-record. I'm going to try to do this a little bit more often because my supporters deserve to be thanked, and I want to keep things more up to date going forward. First off, thank you for returning to the Whiskey Ring. If this is your first time here, or if you're a frequent listener, please take the moment to like and subscribe, rate and review wherever you found the podcast. If you have suggestions for how to make the podcast better, or guests or topics you'd like to hear, please reach out to me at david@whiskymyweddingring.com or via Facebook or Instagram. Second, I want to thank my vintage level sponsors, those at the highest level who keep this podcast going. Truly, without these supporters, I would have had to stop doing this a long time ago. Thank you specifically to Don, to John and Jim, Bill and Connor, Steve, Jake and Bill, Trevor, Michael and Jesse, Jared, Brendan and Larry, Logan, Patrick and Andrew, Dustin, Wade and Gavin, Daniel, and Justin. Thank you all for supporting, listening, telling your friends about this podcast. Cannot stress enough how much you all make this possible to go forward. If you haven't yet joined the Patreon, please consider doing so at patreon.com/whiskeyinmyweddingring. You can support for as little as $5 a month, where you can have access to ad-free episodes, and will also have priority if a vintage spot becomes available. Those spots are strictly limited, so if a spot becomes available, you're going to want to be the first to know. Lastly, going forward, I am trying to be better about posting show notes for each episode on my website, whiskyinmyweddingring.com. These show notes will have links to websites and socials for my guests, and will also have additional information not in the interview, including reviews and tasting notes whenever possible or relevant. Thank you everyone for listening, and I hope to have you back as a listener next week. Hey folks, welcome to a new episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast. Today we are going back down under. I told myself I wasn't going to use that intro, but hey, what the hell. We're going back down under. I'm thrilled to welcome on Greg Ramsay. He has been involved in a number of projects over the years, but I came to know him after a conversation with Bill Welter over at Journeyman, who was on last year. So thank you, Bill, for the introduction. And Greg, welcome on.
Thanks a lot for having me, David.
So today we're going to talk about two projects that Greg is currently involved in. This is starting off very well, I can tell you. The New Zealand Whiskey Collection and Dunedin Distillery at Speight's Brewery. So both of these are New Zealand focused, they're New Zealand located, although you yourself, Greg, are a Tassie. So yeah. I'm hoping that neither side holds that against you.
No, I think actually it's funny. There is some healthy rivalry between New Zealand and Australia, obviously, but living in Tasmania, I think, we are also the butt of a lot of jokes of mainland Australians, and I think New Zealanders warm easier to Tasmanian Australians than to mainland Australians. So I think that counts in our favour a little bit when I'm over in New Zealand.
And New Zealand has we'll talk about it a little bit later, in that it has its own kind of brand as New Zealand and what that means. I am curious, because I have not asked this of previous Tasmanian distillers or producers. New Zealand, well, Australia is known for like every animal there can kill you. Mm-hmm. New Zealand, not so, because it's split away geologically long enough ago that all those animals didn't make it there. So it's actually pretty safe from that standpoint. Tasmania, where does it fall in that kind of spectrum?
I think Tasmania, we haven't got quite, we have one of the most venomous snakes in the world. And we used to have the Tasmanian tiger, which is now extinct. We have the Tasmanian devil, which sort of it hasn't really been known to be at all threatening to humans. So I think we're again somewhere in between New Zealand and Australia. You don't hear a lot about the spiders of Tasmania, or there's very little incidents in anywhere I'm sure you know that there's really no risk anywhere, as long as you don't prod or poke these things too frequently, which sadly, our legendary Steve Irwin found that one out the wrong way. So, yeah.
Very true. So the first project we're going to talk about is the longer of the two, which is the New Zealand Whiskey Collection. Mm-hmm. This has been going on for closer to 2 decades than one at this point. So let's just do like a brief origin story of how the New Zealand Whiskey Collection got started.
Yeah, look, it actually goes right back to the 1960s. So a very successful tea blending and coffee grinding company back in the 60s in Dunedin. So Dunedin is sort of the Scottish heart of New Zealand. It's still the major university town. It's got incredible Scottish architecture everywhere. You could be anywhere in Edinburgh or Glasgow, driving around Dunedin. It was a very, very wealthy city for much of the 1800s, and it was the first sort of seat of commerce where all the banks and insurance companies and traders and everything was in Dunedin, because they not only had massive agricultural expansions, but very, very large mining and gold rushes. And Auckland really didn't take off to the late 1800s. Before that, it was all the South Island, huge whaling and sealing and fishing industries, and Dunedin was, had this incredibly multicultural influx in that a lot of the earliest very successful, very highly regarded businessmen were Chinese merchants that came in, and a lot of the gold rushes were opened up by the Chinese, and there's still a lovely connection. The mayor of Dunedin only 2 terms ago was a direct descendant of those early Chinese traders. So it's got a really fabulous history, and it actually had an incredible investment in a distillery there in 1867. I don't know how this picture probably won't come up too well, but Nick Morgan, who's the corporate historian of Diageo, he believes this picture of 1867, he describes it as the largest known, or to him, the largest known colour image of what he calls a modern production distillery, in that it shows how liquid's being transferred through pumps and pulleys. There's a lot of detail along here. There's like a cooperage making barrels. There's even a stillsmith up here with a big neck of a copper still lying on the ground. And then you can actually see the distillery here. And then, and up here we've got all the vats and tons and a lot of detail, even what they're making. It's got all of this stuff. And that's 1867. So that's incredibly early to have a major sort of industrial investment, not just a craft little back of the farm distillery, but a major downtown distillery by some of those very prominent Scottish migrants in Dunedin. So it had this rich history, and that picture hangs. It's a huge picture. It hangs at the National Gallery and Museum there in Dunedin, which is a fantastic place to visit. It's called the Otago Settlers Museum. And anyway, all over a lot of the British Empire, these distilleries that were popping up in Melbourne and Tasmania and South Africa, Argentina, all around, they actually were closed down all around the same time, late 1860s, early 1870s, because the Scottish banks were the major funders globally of railways. And they had a bit of a whiskey glut at the time as this railway expansion was happening. So they had a lot of exposure to all these distillers and blenders and bottlers around Glasgow in particular, and the Highlands, obviously, of Scotland. So they did this really clever kind of contra deal where they said, look, we'll fund your railways, but we want you to legislate against local distilling. It's incredible that if you look at whiskey versus sort of wine and beer, all these other things have really spread globally around the world, whereas up until about 25, 30 years ago, Scotch was Scotch and bourbon was bourbon. But other than that, there just wasn't a lot of whiskey being made anywhere else. There was a little bit obviously a lot in Japan and a little bit in Ireland, and it's obviously exploded now. But it's quite amazing to think how little there was no small scale distilling. There were no sort of niche industries. There's obviously a lot of illicit distilling in a lot of those countries. Sure. But yeah, so it's quite incredible that an act of Parliament closed down these distilleries globally, and understandably, if you're trading off, can we get railways? Can we get the benefit of transport and freight and sort of opening up these new colonies? Would we rather have railways or would we rather have local distilleries? And obviously, they made the decision. So yeah, but then 100 years later than that, this very successful family, the Baker brothers, they decided they were looking for where Dunedin and Otago might have competitive advantages, and they knew that they were growing a lot of great barley, and they knew there's a really big copper works in Dunedin, just a lot of really talented, knowledgeable people. They said, we'll grab the best graduate from the science department, and we'll send him around the world to research distilling. His name was Dick Borroman. He tells the story wonderfully, how he went around Scotland. No one would open up to him, but he found this 1887, I think it was 1887 book industrial series of books, and one of the volumes was all about distilling, and it has all these magical diagrams and descriptions, and but it's from the 1880s, and he's in Dunedin in the 1960s, and that's what he used to start making stills, working with local coppersmiths, and designing and testing. He got I think it's called a spectrometer, which is something that breaks down, as a scientist, it breaks down any whiskey. So he looked at Irish and bourbon and Scotch, and it breaks it down to its fundamental chemical elements. And he did an interesting way of building a really high volume distillery. And so that was commissioned. They granted the license in 1965. 1966, they started distilling in earnest. And then he chose his mash bill, his blend, the brewing, and then the distilling. Oh, and because one of the major investors in this company were also the biggest maltsters in New Zealand, so huge malting plant already. So they had all this combined sort of skill sets, and he brought it all together. And the whiskey was launched in 1974 as Wilson's. And Wilson was a fellow, he was a brewer, in a very prominent early figure in Dunedin, and his grandson was the then running Wilson's malt extract company. So they made malt, for like chocolate drinks, and they made malt for baby syrup, and they made malt extract for all sorts of things. But also they malted for the breweries. And so James Wilson's, they had a big naming competition publicly, and I think they threw out about 6 different options, and all the votes came into the local big newspaper, and they chose Wilson's. And the cool thing is we now employ James Wilson's great grandson as one of our sales directors on the road, based out of Cromwell in Central Otago. So he travels all around, and he's literally got James Wilson's book, like brewing handbook, from when he sold his brewery and his malting plant in 1876 to James Speight, Thomas Greenslade, and Dawson, and that became Speight's Brewery. So there's this nice connection that we've now put our stills, we've now built our distilleries as a production partnership with Speight's Brewery in downtown Dunedin. And it's sort of like a bit of a full circle, return to all of those original roots of brewing, distilling in Dunedin.
And this hadn't occurred to me, and again, it had been mentioned on previous Australasia episodes of the podcast, that New Zealand was a huge craft beer scene. It was basically, at one point, it was Belgium, then Oregon, then New Zealand, as concentrations of craft beer producers. As I said, in the late 19th century, distillers were shut down in the trade for railroads. But I would imagine breweries didn't suffer the same thing, because you couldn't really transport beer in the same way at that point. So has New Zealand always been this big beer producer and consumer?
Yeah, look, I would say that because of the hops, like across New Zealand, there's quite a few little hop growing pockets. And the major one is up around Nelson, but on the North Island and even down in the South Island, in the southern end of the South Island, there were a lot of hops grown, a lot of different varieties. That helps. Barley's sort of grown all over New Zealand, at a really high quality. But also, there's something quite different about New Zealand's little economic communities. It's got a lot of cities, sort of 20,000 to 60 or 80,000, a lot more what I would call like a small urban community, but very connected to its surrounds and its rural economy around it. Australia, I don't feel, has that same sort of community makeup. Local craft brewing, I mean, I can look at like McCashin's up at Nelson. Like any city around New Zealand sort of seemed to have craft breweries before it became trendy. They weren't craft breweries, they were just the local brewery. So Christchurch had Canterbury Draft, and Waikato had Waikato Draft, and Lion was really big around Auckland, as was DB, and then Wellington had its own breweries, and so all of these different cities, which, I mean, they're not big cities, but all these cities had their own breweries. Whereas in Australia, they all got closed down, and you just ended up with Tui's in Sydney and Brisbane, and sort of Carlton United breweries in which is Foster's and Carlton Draft and so on. in Melbourne. They're quite different. All the other little regional breweries around Australia pretty much closed down. I mean, there was South Australia had a couple of options, and Western Australia there was one, but that's sort of only six brands for all of Australia. Whereas New Zealand, had 20 distinctively smaller, all doing funky little flavors and different styles of their beers. So, yeah, I think, and I did see that article that I think Oregon now has the highest percentage of beer sold of its total beer market is local craft. As in, I can't remember if craft was measured by under 10 employees or like under 100,000 litres. I can't remember what the measurement was, but yeah, it was Oregon, Belgium, and New Zealand are the three biggest consumers and supporters of their local beers, of their local craft beers. Mm.
I can see it for sure in Belgium and Oregon. I said I never thought of New Zealand as a third one, but this hasn't happened so much in Belgium. There are some distilleries in Belgium, and I've been fortunate to taste a couple of them, putting out great stuff. But in Oregon and California and Washington State, huge explosion of distilleries, and particularly early on, like pre-craft boom in the U.S. in the late 70s and 80s. Those were the first craft distilleries in the U.S. And a number of guests from those regions have said like there's almost an inevitability to it, that you're going to have this craft beer movement. You're using barley all the time, maybe not hops so much, but using barley all the time and brewing, and then you just extend it into distilling. Now, hindsight is 2020, of course, but do you feel like with New Zealand being such a strong beer producer and consumer, there was a similar inevitability that they would also become this, what I think is a big player in distilling as well?
Yeah, no, it's certainly evolving into that. I think things like 42 Below, the success of that vodka brand, and the whole very clever way, the sort of irreverent, quirky branding and storytelling, and I mean it was big in New Zealand before it went big globally, but that probably awoke a lot of New Zealand's maybe brewers, maybe even winemakers. I mean, a lot of winemakers have got into it as well because they've got barrels, and we all know how important barrels are. But I think in some ways, New Zealand Distillery down in Dunedin, the fact that the Baker brothers sold to Seagram's, so Seagram's ran this distillery between the early 1980s. They bought it and until the mid or late 1990s, and they ran it really big. They brought in single malts instead of just blends. They pushed the blend big. They really funded a big expansion in that. But the main thing they did was launch a brand called Lamalore, which actually at one stage was doing like 62,000 cases across America. And I first came across that when I was living and working in Scotland, which is where I met Bill Welter. And I found Lamalore just sitting in Royal Mile Whiskies. Keir Sword, the owner there in Edinburgh, and I'm holding this New Zealand whiskey. And I was probably 5 or 6 months away from going back to Tasmania. And I just thought, wow, if the Kiwis are doing this, why wouldn't we be doing this in Tasmania? So this was 1996. Bill Lark had been, he had started in New Zealand, in Tasmania, but I hadn't actually read any press about Bill. But then I started doing some online searching, and then I found Bill, and I reached out to Bill Lark. So I said, look, I really want to restore this old flour mill in my village into a whiskey distillery. Do you have any interest? So that's how it all started. Yeah.
And I have a feeling I know the answer to this, but it's not immediately apparent. So you're Tasmanian, but you're involved with these two New Zealand projects. Why not, to put it bluntly, why not take on these projects in Tasmania, which, as you're pointing out, has its own significant distilling scene?
Yeah, so it's an obvious question to ask, and the answer is pretty straightforward. So I was able to build that restoration. I proposed and project managed the conversion of Australia's oldest flour mill into a modern whiskey distillery. So I sort of got a real buzz out of that. I didn't feel like going into competition against it. I'd already worked for Bill Lark. I didn't feel like going into competition against Bill. We had a lot of clients. Like I helped Launceston Distillery set up our first distiller at Nant Distillery. Ended up setting up Launceston Distillery, I was helping. I was doing Kingsbarns in Scotland at the time. I was helping Bill Welder with Journeyman and really enjoying that. I didn't feel like my distilling crave was not being met by my offshore and in Tasmania projects. And then because I'd set up these distilleries and was consulting to quite a lot, we had a website, and then the receiver who'd been appointed by the bank for the Preston family. He rang me, said they had 80,000 litres of whiskey. They needed someone to value, and could I help with valuing? And I thought, gee, I'm not sure I can on my own, but I'll get Bill Lark. So we proposed a fee, and they flew us both over, and we spent a week picking our way through barrels. And the really interesting thing was we got sent this ledger with 240 barrels of single malt, with every barrel sort of detail of the ABV and the litres and the Laos and so on, and the barrel description of whether it was ex-Merlot or Syrah or, ex-bourbon casks, all this information. And then there's just one line saying 256 barrels blend. Just that's all it said. So we thought that must be pretty plain. But the good thing was that all of that whiskey, the Preston family, who were a really big wine family from the North Island, they had a really famous winery called Mills Reef. They moved down to Oamaru, bought all this stock, and they took a lot of the blended whiskey that was in vats ready for going into bottling runs. They took that and put it back in their red wine barrels. So that's where we got the Dunedin double cask from. That they had so much blended whiskey that they thought, well, all the stuff that's still in barrels, we'll leave that in barrels. We'll leave that in the ex Four Roses barrels from Kentucky. But all this stuff in vats, we'll just put that back into our red wine wood and see what that does. And that whiskey was amazing. And that really, we relaunched it here as the Dunedin Double. That's a very early branding of it, the Dunedin Double Wood. That's when it was a 10-year-old. We strung that out to an 18-year-old in the end, but then we decided we were just losing too much in Angel share. It wasn't actually winning any character, so we took it all out and bottled it up as 18-year-old. And that that you can see the color of it there. It's really rich ruby red. We think it was one of the longest red wine matured whiskies in the world at the time, because it had 4 years in American oak ex bourbon barrels, and then it was put into vats for bottling. And that's when the Prestons took it and put it in their ex Syrah, their ex Merlot, their ex Cabernet Sauvignon casks, and so on. And that's what gave it that amazing flavour and this tannic, fruity, really sort of Christmas cakey kind of notes from the red wine wood. So, and the other nice thing is it gave that little hint of pepper and spice from the French oak. So it we always wanted to keep that style. What we bought was a huge amount of red wine cask maturing whiskey, a huge amount of really old, 10 to 20-year-old ex-bourbon, all American oak, ex-Four Roses Kentucky Distillery, because that's what Seagram's, when they owned it, sent all these barrels to New Zealand to get bottled in New Zealand, and they had these spent casks. So that's why one of the reasons they bought the distillery was then to fill up those spent casks with this spirit from this promising little Dunedin distillery. And then the other one we had was the original Wilson's whiskey, which we always kept as well. So we had three very distinctive styles and colours, and one was a blend. Oh, sorry, one was a blend. One was, we call it the double wood, but it was also a blend. And then we had all the single malt. So we just thought New Zealand whiskey collection. We don't want to homogenise all these into one big, pour it all in together and make one really narrow style. We'll just we'll celebrate the diversity of it.
And I heard you say in a couple of interviews that the wood, and I think this was specific to the Wilson's barrels, the blends, the wood was kind of ratty. Was this when you got it, or when the Prestons had gotten it before they put it into their wine casks?
No, look, they'd been used quite a few times. There's no doubt about that. And the barrels, as in the Prestons, didn't refill any barrels because they weren't ever distilling. They were just they were basically independent bottlers. As effectively we started as well. But a lot of the barrels were, they were pretty tired. Some of them were leaking. Anything that leaked, we just immediately got it out. But they were, I reckon some of them honestly were fourth or fifth fill. They were just so, sucked out. But, there's something about, what I liked about that is Lammerlaw, which then became Milford, as in the Prestons called that single malt whiskey Milford, was a very spirit forward whiskey, and I really love spirit forward. It was very pale in colour. It was all you could still taste that ferment and the grain and the that real malty biscuity note. It wasn't drowned out with with oak or with the the influence of the previous contents of the cask. So um, yeah, I still really love spirit forward whiskey where it's not all about the the export or the ex sherry. I mean, the market loves colourful whiskey. The market, always this was a bigger seller in every market except the UK for us. Because I think the Scots, the Brits, like their whiskey to be yellow, but I think the rest of the world like to almost see flavour in the bottle before they touch it. So, yeah,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah, I mean, looking at the shelf that's next to me, the scotches are mainly pretty dark, but then I've also got a French whiskey that's about 5 years old from Ninkasi that is, I mean, it's got some color to it. I'd probably say it was probably a first fill bourbon. Without, I have the stats on it somewhere, but it's probably first fill, second fill at most, because it still has some color to be given to it. But I know you've called out in particular Wolfburn in way north of Scotland as one of those that you really love for being spirit forward. And we had Mark from Wolfburn on a couple of years ago now. And I remember thinking he's got like a 7 or 8 year old whiskey, and it's still pretty pale at 7 or 8 years old. And like you said, maybe that's just like I don't care because at this point I know it's not about how the whiskey looks, it's about how it tastes.
mm-mm.
But
And
if
look,
you're the everyday consumer,
yeah, consumers are so particularly with this big influx of people of new whiskey drinkers. I think that color gave them some assurity that it had a depth to it. It had a richness to it. But whereas a lot of people don't realize that, I'm not exactly sure when they started adding, caramel, flavorless caramel coloring to whiskey, caramel coloring. But, the green bottles and the brown bottles were because, particularly the Isla malts were very watery. They were very pale. So they would look very unimpressive up against some of the, the Speyside or the Lowland malts that were using and activating a lot of French or Spanish, bodegas and ex wine casks and ex sherry and ex port. So they would go green or brown bottle. But also because back in the day where if it was flocking, you didn't see any flocking if your bottle was green or brown. So if you wanted to leave that rich texture in it, you whereas if you had a clear glass, you could see the color, but you'd also see any flocking. So I should research when they started, using that caramel additive for color, but it's, something thankfully we've never had to do, and I never wanted to. I'd love to think there's a discerning market out there of volume that actually really crave pale, watery looking whiskey, because all the early Lafroigs and Bunnahabens and Carlilas that I used to drink back in when I was 18, living and working in St Andrews, working in what was then known as the world's largest single malt whiskey menu. That they were just water. You'd pour them out, and they were just so pale. And I reckon they were third and fourth fill ex bourbon barrels, but with incredible, structure across the palate and incredible flavors.
I think also from an American perspective, we're conditioned now to think darker is better. Because after Prohibition, when you had to use first use American oak for your whiskeys, I'm going to correct myself on that. Sorry, it's virgin oak, not American oak, but virgin oak. It just happened to be mostly American. You're going to get a ton of color out of that. Even if it's 6 months to a year, you're going to get a ton of color out of that. Let alone 8, 10, 20 years if you can age it that long. But if you're using casks 3, 4, 5 times like they do in Scotland and they do elsewhere around the world, at a certain point there's just no more color to be gotten out of it. And I mean, you've said tonight, but also you've said in previous interviews, like you don't, on the whiskey that you're creating now in the Dunedin Distillery located with Speight's, that you don't want a lot of wood influence in your whiskey. You want to use the tired, not ratty or leaking necessarily, but the tired barrels that are more maturation vessels rather than coloring and flavor giving vessels.
And sweetening, yeah, yeah. I've been interested. Now we've refilled quite a few ex journeyman casks. They're 55-liter barrels, so they're 15 gallons, and we've refilled. And it's interesting the savoury notes that we're getting out of that second fill, because the first fill is still, it's got so much that corn syrup in there and corn spirit, and it's still sucking a lot of journeyman bourbon notes in New Zealand single malt whiskey. By the time you fill it, the second one, it hasn't got the sweetness, but it's got this, and it's got this savoury, like softness. The butteriness doesn't turn into sort of pineapple and banana. The buttery turns into more of a tactile. It's not tannic, but it's more of a tactile, grippy kind of savoury note that I really enjoy. And I think over time it'll be interesting to see how that rounds out. I actually think it will go sweeter, but they're only 3 years in that second fill bourbon cask. I think we'll get a third fill out of them, and then after that we'll shave and char and toast them, and maybe even some of them don't stand up to a third fill. We'll see. It's really fun seeing the evolution, because we bought a lot of ex journeyman rye, ex bourbon, and ex wheat, and they all perform very different.
I bet, yeah. Having some, I haven't had as many from kind of New World whiskey distillers that are doing this, but the few that I've had that use, I'm thinking of Isle of Ramsay in Scotland, who are using ex rye casks, and there just aren't a lot of places using ex rye, let alone ex wheat, or ex wheated stuff is even rarer. It's usually, at best, you might know that it's ex bourbon. Maybe you'll know it's Brown Forman or Jack Daniels or the parent company, but then it depends on your broker. So I like the idea that your casks are coming from Bill and Johanna, and in that way you can control the flavor too.
Very much so. So and Michael, our head distiller, keeps a really good log of just how, the wheat ones have been interesting. Initially we felt that it was a bit flat, that the ex-wheat spirit just wasn't putting as much interest, I suppose. It certainly wasn't putting the same sweetness. It was putting almost this sort of dusty kind of cereal note through the single malt whiskey. But then over time that's actually evolved out into more of a porridge. It's not like an oat whiskey, but there's a more of a porridgey kind of note, and that the wheat spirit isn't malted at all, so it hasn't got that sweetness coming through, but there's a more of a creamy biscuity thing, and it's and the rye again. I think the rye, you get this incredible intense pepper and spice out of the rye, and I'm not a massive rye drinker. There's some rye whiskies I just adore, but I wouldn't say it's my go-to category. But what I am liking is you can use that rye, an ex-rye cask, as a blending mix, with leading with the ex-bourbons, and then maybe some ex-wheats as well. But then the rye, actually, that spicy peppery note is softening over time, and more of the sweetness again is coming out, and it's fascinating to follow it all. That's one of the reasons we did this. We did the whiskey here called the Single Malt Masterclass, and it's all about, we feel so lucky that we get to taste all these barrels, whereas with these you get half a bottle, so 350 ml of new make spirit, and then you can choose ex-French oak, ex-rye, ex-wheat, ex-bourbon, ex-American oak, all these different ones you can choose for your second one. We call it the single malt studies. That's our actual distilling team there. It's Michael and Cyril. So Cyril started distilling in 1974 as a 14-year-old boy in Dunedin, so he's still a fantastic distiller. And Michael there, and basically, you can choose your second. This is obviously empty, but you can choose your what you want to do, and you can line them all up and just see how that spirit's maturing. It's only 1 year old, so we can't call it whiskey, so it's just called single malt studies, and people can study how that maturation is evolving in the barrel, and how the different barrels sort of treat the new make spirit, because we're really proud of the new make spirit. Everyone gushes over it, and rightly so, because Michael put a lot of time into getting that right. I gave him some pretty, I suppose, specific requests. I wouldn't say instructions, but requests that if we could do this and do that. And I learned a lot of that from Mark, talking to Mark at Wolfburn, because we used to line up next to them at Whisky Live in Paris, because we shared the same distributor. And I just love their spirit right from day one. So and I'm thrilled to see how well they're still going. They were just a startup Scottish whiskey. In some ways, they got it harder than we have. Because being in Scotland as a startup against all these behemoths, and they've done great. Whereas we're in New Zealand, there's only sort of 4 or 5 other really prominent distilleries in a market that's still growing its interest in local whiskey, which is really good for us. Mm.
For sure. And so before diving fully into the new distillery, I want to spend just a few more minutes on the New Zealand whiskey collection from the older stock that you had. And so you said at one point you're asked to assess 80,000 liters of spirit, several hundred casks. You bring in Bill Lark to help, but that's also been quite a while since that's happened. And I think it's, as of the last interview where it was mentioned, you only had about 20 casks left of that original stock.
Yeah, yeah. It's actually what we've got is 14 barrels and one vintage in bottle. So we did a really good launch with Sir Edmund Hillary for his family foundation. We're raising some money, so we did a launch with that. So we used our last 1990 cask, but we kept the last 50 bottles of that, and so that's 1990 already bottled. It's 64% ABV, but then all the others are still they haven't been bottled yet. So we've got 14 other barrels from 1987 until 1993. 1993 is a sad story. That was sort of accidentally grabbed and started bottling before someone realised, oh, this is the last 1993. So we've only got about half a cask of 1993 too, which is the smokiest, peatiest of those vintage casks. Yeah, we've got a really exciting project to bring those to market as a way of helping launch all of our new whiskies in offshore markets. Yeah, I mean, there's only the total of all of that original 87 to 93. It's only 1,800 bottles, so it's a pretty rare and scarce treasure.
For sure. And as the years have gone on, you were able to start in the larger format bottles, 700, 750 ml, depending on the market. But over time, I know you had to shrink bottle size to just stretch it out because you had a finite supply of this. Particularly in where the whiskey market is today, as we're seeing a kind of global plateauing, not downturn, but plateauing. Do you think that that same marketing and process, in that you were able to shrink the bottles, the price kind of kept going up because it was still a valuable commodity, would that still be economically viable in today's climate?
I think it will be for our vintage casks. Our two main advisors, and that's Sikinder Singh and Thierry Benatar, who've both been fantastic distributors for us across Europe, and they've always been incredibly generous and interested in the New Zealand whiskey because they remember when they were first getting into whiskey. Thierry brought in New Zealand whiskey from Seagram's. He brought that in even before he brought Nika across Europe. I mean, so he's got this affection for the old Lamalore and the spirit. He always really loved the spirit. It was he talks about how fresh and youthful it is. Like, I was with him late last year at Singapore Whiskey Live, and he had he just said, Greg, I can't believe that 1991, it's a 28-year-old whiskey. I just can't believe how fresh and youthful it still is. He keeps using these lovely descriptors. But no, with our new whiskies, we want to be a really relevant, affordable value whiskey. Yeah, we don't want to be an elitist, only single cask, $200 a bottle. We want to be an $80, $90 bottle, and that's what we are in New Zealand and in Australia. We'd rather be a bit lower priced, but our major retail partner there, Dan Murphy's, are really adamant that we should stay where we're at and utilise discounting and create value because it's ticking over steadily. $120 for a 500 ml bottle, and to me that's expensive. But people are still coming to it. But the South Island single malt in Australia hasn't taken off like we hoped, so we probably do need to do some massaging and investment in the brand there and the explanation, because that was a 25-year-old whiskey for the last 12 years at Dan Murphy's, and Dan Murphy's the biggest retailer right across Australia. It's sort of it's the main account that matters. And they, yeah, we haven't rolled out that South Island single malt as a no age statement whiskey as successfully as we would have liked. So hopefully, we can address that in the next year.
And with Dan Murphy's, I think LMDW is your distributor in France and in multiple parts of Europe, and they seem to me like the LMDW, La Maison de Whisky of Australia, and that like if there's one account you want to be a part of, it's Dan Murphy's.
Yeah, it's interesting though. Dan Murphy's is a massive. Its background is as a big supermarket chain. But what they've done very well is, while they're a big box booze or bottle shop, it feels classy. Their range, particularly in premium spirits, is the best. So it's funny to go to a big box sort of discount retailer, but it doesn't feel discount. Their prices are still the best, but they're offering, whether you're looking for mezcal or aged rum, or incredibly local gin range, or single malt whiskies, or they're one of the few places that will sell cask strength whiskey. But it's actually a huge chain, similar to Binny's in around Chicago, but it doesn't feel like a discount venue. So it's different to La Maison in that, and La Maison is more of a distributor, and they sell to national partners, and they have, I only think, 4 of their own stores, and they have a huge online presence. So they're the biggest independent spirits wholesaler or distributor across Europe, but they're also one of the biggest online e-commerce platforms.
And you mentioned Sukhinder saying he's going to be a guest. I'm interviewing him in early May after meeting him last month. So I'm very much looking forward to that. And he also, I know you'll know this, but he shares your preference for less wood influence, especially when it comes to sherry. It's like we've been over-sherrying these whiskeys. So that will definitely be part of the conversation there too. So I'm really looking forward to that.
Well, I was a guest of Sukhinder and Ollie Chilton at Tormore. What they're doing at Tormore in Speyside is so exciting, and to bring that brand back to life, and even, I mean, the property is so distinctive looking, as a distillery, as a destination, and I really hope they can get it firing as one of the go-to hubs on the Speyside Whiskey Trail, because I think, I mean, it inherently looks, everyone's been driving past it for 50 years going, wow, what's that massive behemoth with Art Deco beauty, so
Right.
yeah, it's in the right hands with those guys. It's going to be a lot of fun watching that journey.
Yeah, it's described as, I mean, you can see in pictures, it's one of the prettiest distilleries, if not the prettiest, in Scotland. And as a fun dovetail to this conversation, built by Shenley, Seagram's main competitor for most of the mid 20th century. So, yes, I have a couple of Tormore bottles, their Blueprint series, as well as a couple of independent bottlings. But I'm looking forward to bringing that story. And it made me think, too, because of how you were describing LMDW and Dan Murphy's comparison. There's also the Whiskey Exchange, which, of course, Sukhinder and his brother founded. That's also this major player in the UK, and I think the first e-commerce for whiskey. So huge influence there. And again, so there are more options than just one. But like if it's one of those things where, like, if you're on the Whiskey Exchange, you have better chance of eyes seeing it, getting eyes on your product. So so New Zealand, because of this stock, I mean, New Zealand's the third country also to have a 30-year-old single malt, after Scotland, of course, and then Japan. And then for one more Scottish connection, you found out that you had family, a couple, maybe a generation or two back, who had been a master at Mortlock.
Yeah. And actually, if we go back to spirit forward whiskies, I'm always saddened that Mortlock now, which I still love Mortlock, it's very rich coloured whiskey, whereas the ones I look for are the signatories and the independent bottlings, which are the very pale. Like, I got a brand I'd never heard of, but from Whiskey Galore in Christchurch in New Zealand, called Hepburn's Choice, and it was this completely pale, watery Mortlock, and it was very affordable. It was like $90 or something. Yeah, so Mortlock was where my great-great-great-grandfather was the head mashman. So that basically meant he was the head of the brewing team. And there's a great picture of him and all of his mashmen, his brewers and distillers, and William Grant is on the other end of it. So he was the head bookkeeper. So when I was 18, I went and lived and worked in Scotland for a year because I wanted to figure out how to turn this old golf course on our farm and our family farm in Tasmania's Highlands, which was been recognised for since World War II as Australia's oldest golf course, and I wanted to figure out how to turn that golf history into golf tourism. So I went to St Andrews in Scotland. I got a job caddying during the day, and at nights I found, like most caddies, I was just spending all my income drinking with my golf guests or with my other caddies, and you just piss it all up against the wall. So I thought I better get a job in the nighttime so I don't save a few dollars, and then so I went and got a job at the Road Hole Bar, which at the time promoted itself as having the world's largest single malt menu. So we had a 286 odd single malts, and it was a really good year to be in Scotland, Dave, because Diageo just the year before had launched the classic malts of Scotland. So they'd finally someone had said, let's really invest in the terroir of single malt. Let's really invest in this category of different styles for different regions. So I'm sure you remember the whole offering. It was like Glenkinchie was your lowland malt, and Cragganmore or Dalwhinnie was your Highland, and Speyside malt. Obviously, Lagavulin was the Isla malt, and Talisker was the West Island malt, the West Coast Island malt from Skye. So it was an incredible year because a lot of the other staff there were sort of French wine based, and they called me the single malt sommelier, and they sort of, even though I was this Aussie kid, here I am, I'm 18 years old, and I took everyone from Clint Eastwood and Catherine Zeta-Jones and Prince Andrews and his entourage on this, what we used to call this whiskey tour of Scotland. So you just literally you'd go from Glenkinchie to Cragganmore to Dalwhinnie to Talisker to Lagavulin, and that was that was an incredible way. And every other week we would either have a blender or a bottler come to do training at the Old Course Hotel because we were such an important venue for telling brand stories. So we had the British Open there that year and the Dunhill Cup, which is this huge sort of celebrity golf event, a big pro-am. It used to be actually it is now a big pro-am like Pebble Beach, but back then it was this international tournament. And, we had Tiger Woods and Mark O'Meara, all the names, Nick Faldo, everyone playing there. Arnold Palmer and Jack Nicklaus, everyone staying in this hotel. So the brand ambassadors and the distilleries really invested in, the 5 or 6 of us that were single malt sommeliers. And we'd be hosted up at their distilleries or their malt house or so on. So we got this ridiculous investment in us because we were, one of their main 3 or 4 embassies for telling the story of their whiskey. So, and we used to get our tips split up on how we could upsell through the malt menus. All the Japanese had come in, and asked for, say, a Glenfiddich. All the American golfers would be coming in and just ask for a Dewar's or a Glenlivet. It was so predictable what they'd ask for. And so we'd maybe give them that and say, oh, Nick, would you like to try something different, something of different style, different. And then, and the tips were fantastic. So, yeah, we had our tips all pooled but then divided on who'd been able to keep progressively upselling. So we had a 1926 Glen Grant. That was the ultimate to get someone to. They brought in for the British Open, the Dunhill Cup. They brought in all this really aged stuff, pre-war stuff, and that was the ultimate. If you could just get someone in a very responsible drinking way to keep working their way up to those £100 nips. I mean, I've still got the menu, David. It was so cheap, £2.80 for a Balvenie. All these great whiskies that now Royal Lochnagar and Bracklayer and all these and they were like £1.80 or £2.80 back then for a dram because people didn't value single malt like they did now.
I gotta ask, how much was that 1926? It
was £120. That's all.
God,
I've got the menu actually. I should have had that here as a prompter. I'll send that through to you. The pictures of the menu. Yeah,
please do. Yeah, I mean, now you got 1926 and 27, 28 Macallans going for millions, literally millions per bottle on auctions, and you could have got it for £120.
Yeah,
it makes me. No. I mean, granted, I was like 8 when you were there, but I still wish I had been able to. That sounds so cool. So with the movie from the New Zealand whiskey collection, and I should note this is all part of the New Zealand whiskey collection. Like it's a single company.
Yeah.
But I'm differentiating the kind of older stocks that you had versus the new things that you're distilling.
Mm-hmm.
So you had a lot of really kind of fortunate connections come your way in this. You mentioned already you had a couple of industry connections that you knew that, and you'd already had experience building distilleries, so project planning them out. But in addition to that, because Seagram's had this presence, and then the Prestons had it, and once
And
you got to
Foster's
and
had it in
Foster's,
between those two. Yeah.
right, exactly. So through Foster's, you had things that most revivals of brands don't have. I mean, you had corporate and technical knowledge live, like living people who like Cyril who had worked at the company, and then there's a similar parallel in my mind to Dick Stoll working at Michter's and then coming back for Stoll and Wolf here in Pennsylvania. But you don't get much of that. You had corporate and technical knowledge. You had video walkthroughs of the old distillery, and the stills that were there. I know Foster's moved them over to Fiji for rum, right?
Yeah, and
So,
I haven't done enough with it, but I went and visited those stills. They're still making Ratu rum. They're huge. They're huge, and they're wood fired. They in Fiji. It's now actually owned by Coca-Cola, that distillery. But yeah, they're still in action, or they were when I was there a couple of years ago. So they were looking to decommission and refresh and go to gas, but I reckon that all got put on hold.
yeah, I can't imagine. I mean, wood firing. I've seen the size of the stills. They're massive. That can't
Yeah.
be energy efficient in any kind of way at this point.
Actually, it's a bit misleading there. Sorry, it's a wood-fired boiler. Sorry, so it's
Oh,
a
okay.
steam coil still, which is what they were in Dunedin. But yeah, they had this huge, it looked like they'd chopped down a whole pine forest just to feed,
Yeah,
blocks of green timber into this boiler, which actually can be very efficient, to be honest. If it's really green wood like that, it boils really hot and it cooks really hot and really slow basically into a coal. Mm.
true. So when you had this influx and availability of knowledge to continue tradition, brand, etc., to a certain extent, but to what extent are you seeking to either replace or backfill the whiskey that you had versus using that knowledge but setting a new course with the distillery?
Look, we always wanted to build a sustainable, ongoing, legacy business. I think we knew we liked the style of Wilson's and Lamelore and Milford. Like we liked what they were making, and then we really liked what the Prestons had done by putting all of that, that ex American oak bourbon spirit into red wine barrels. So that's why a lot of people still say, "Oh, Greg, just simplify. You get it back to one brand. You got too many brands." And I think we are going to cut a few SKUs. We do need to get back, but I think our core is still really solid. That we've got your classic, Speyside style, for want of a better word, Speyside, American oak ex bourbon cask whiskey, which is our South Island single malt, which is this one here, and that sort of it looks, and everyone says how reminiscent it is, of those classic um, whiskies of Speyside. And at the end of the day, there'll always be a market for that. People love that whiskey. I mean, that's the old Dunedin. That's Speight's Brewery on the
Nice.
back there. That's now where our distillery is. So there'll always be a market for that yellow whiskey. And Finian Sedgwick, one of our board members, who has just launched his own fabulous Irish whiskey called Black Emerald. Everyone should get on that. Finian was amazed that this whiskey, is sort of right on 3 years old, was so lush and it had so much complexity. And he said, Greg, there's something very special about that bubblegum sweetness in that. It's probably not everyone's cup of tea, but if you're a bourbon or a rum drinker, that's the whiskey that they're going to want. So there's something very special as a 3-year-old, and it'll probably evolve out and lose some of that character and that freshness and so on. So that's a really interesting evolution story. and we know the market really likes the big rich ruby red whiskey too. So we're still doing that as the Dunedin double cask, which it comes in its own packaging that honours that colouring. And then the Omaruvian, I'm not sure if you've ever had it, David, but the Omaruvian's a whiskey that was this whiskey, and a French blogger said, I really like this whiskey. This Dunedin Doublewood is really fabulous, but gosh, I'd like to try it at cask strength. And I started off doing it by saying to our bottling team, look, find some really safe ex Merlot, just some really soft ex Cab Sav casks. Like we'll put it out. We'll put one out. We'll call it the Omaruvian, which all the locals argue, oh, that's a terrible word. No one's heard of Omaruvian. But I was like, no, that's strong. I thought Lafroig, I've always loved the lettering. Lafroig is such a weird name, and Bunnahabhain and Brookladdy, they're all such a weird mash of letters. But the brand, the stencil brand of just slap it on logo, and that's what the Omaruvian, looks like still to this day. Um, and and it went really well. But then someone said, oh, I wonder what it'd be like out of a Syrah cask. And I was purposely avoiding these really jammy, heavy whiskies because to me, to be honest, they're a bit overpowering with that tannic, grippy kind of texture. Anyway, Dawn Davies at the Whisky Exchange, she taught me a word I'd never heard of. It's a wine word. She said, Greg, this Omaruvian is so unctuous. Unctuous is a word I'd not heard before. I said, oh, unctuous, what does that mean? How do you spell it? And she said, oh, it just means it's got this very, very tactile palate filling, but also a little bit stripping. So it's moreish, you want to have a bit more. So that was a good little lesson in wine words for whiskey. And it's not a word that people actually apply often to whiskey, but that had just been, by that stage, those whiskies had been 12 years in the ex-New Zealand red wine barrels. So that's not a finish. That's a full maturation nearly. So,
for sure. I mean, it's longer than the initial maturation of 4-ish years in the Four Roses casks.
And the DNA of the Omaruvian has always been that it must spend more time in the red wine barrel than it had in the American oak ex-bourbon barrel. That's sort of the DNA of it. Yeah. And it casts strength. I mean, the Omaruvian is almost ink black because it's just been in that red wine barrel so long.
Right. I mean, you kind of answered this a little bit, but I'll still ask it in that New Zealand, the wine scene in New Zealand is flourishing. I like New Zealand's a lot, both red and white. They're just such powerful wines, I feel like. A lot of minerality, a lot of just powerful flavor, higher ABV. You're getting 15, 16% in some of those. But I imagine that's got to interact differently with the whiskey or the spirit that's being put into it, as opposed to, like you're saying, like some of the lighter grapes that you might get from France, Italy, even Northern Europe or elsewhere. So, is that something that when you're deciding which wines to use, like you said, you wanted to stay away from the Syrah, it was a little too jammy and things like that, but a Merlot or a Cab Sauv is okay. Where did you build the kind of mental catalog that, all right, I think this wine's going to work, this wine from New Zealand is going to work, as opposed to perhaps this other grape?
Well, when I was in Scotland, obviously working in the bar, we had it was one of the top sort of tourist bars of Scotland. So we not only had all this training in whiskey, but also in wine. And Bill Lark, when I came back to Tasmania, and I did a lot of work with Bill, a lot of projects for him and Lynn, and Bill taught me so much about export and ex-sherry cask. In fact, we got on a small plane and flew up to Griffith, which is in Central Australia. It's a huge wine growing area, massive bulk wine growing area, just bulk. It's not like McLaren Vale or Barossa or the Hunter Valley. It's just bulk wine. And back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, bulk wine in Australia just got put into sherry flagons, not little bottles or boxes, but these big flagons. Every house drank sherry and port. And anyway, so we went and we were able to buy like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of extra sherry and port barrels up there for $45 because no one wanted them there. Now they're $600, $700, $800. But at that time, we were just lucky through a few contacts, and they were like, oh, they're decommissioning a massive sherry bond store, a fortification plant, and so we were, so Bill taught me a lot about that, and but it's not something I want to do in New Zealand. New Zealand hasn't got a lot of provenance around sherry or port. There are a couple, and we'll work with them. We've already had some great discussions, but I think New Zealand is known for world class Central Otago Pinot, which is obviously where we are. We're in Otago, um, and up in Hawke's Bay, fantastic Syrah, fantastic Cab Sav. But Hawke's Bay is on the North Island, and freight is expensive moving barrels around. So, we really like what those ex Pinot casks do for the whiskey, and it's a local authentic provenance that Australian whiskey can't do in the same way. So yeah.
And just with the freight, I always keep that in mind when I think of pricing. Is from what I've heard from other distillers and producers in the area, New Zealand is not drinking a ton of its own whiskey yet. Like we've spoken to Waiheke and Thompson and Pokeno, some of them up in Auckland, where it's the largest city. It's 1.6 million people, I think, and they're like this, but there's just not that much of a market really. It's mainly still export driving sales. And again, I forget who said this. It was either Waiheke or Thompson, where there's like, we want to use New Zealand barley, but it's cheaper to get barley shipped from Scotland than it is to get malted barley shipped from Scotland than it is to get it from the other end of the island in New Zealand. And that's just the practicalities of shipping grain around.
Yeah, it's called Bank Strait between North and South Island, and the cost of transport across that is the same as getting something from Chicago to to New Zealand, and we have a similar dynamic in Australia where the Bass Strait between Melbourne and Tasmania, it's ridiculously expensive local freight charges. I'm still surprised to hear it's cheaper to get Scottish malted barley. I mean, we don't look at that because we want to we want to be made of New Zealand, and we're just using. I mean, there's a fantastic malting plant in the South Island. Gladfield's malt, they can work with anything, whether we want peated, just whatever, toasting or, barley grain style, whatever we want to do, they can work with anything. We've now got one of our shareholders who's a local farmer. He sent 11 tonne up, really high yielding malt that we've grown off the valley. It's only, 25 minutes from the Bond store. So, we want to keep it local. The market in New Zealand, I think, has enormous growth. I mean, Matt at Pokeno has done an incredible good job right around. He gets on the road and he goes and visits all the liquor lands, and they do tastings and staff training, and I think he's done a great job. And then also Matt Thompson, he's worked it really hard, particularly around Auckland, which is obviously the highest concentration of whiskey spenders and whiskey drinkers. Both of those are doing a fabulous job. Feet on the pavement, working the sales channels. Scapegrace is another one that I'm really excited when they come out with the new spirit from their new big distillery on Lake Dunstan. It's a beautiful, beautiful property. They've made a huge investment. They have a really power gin brand, which is really lovely. It used to be called Rogue Society, but it's been known as Scapegrace for at least 10 years now. So what they're doing is really good. And then, 1919 Distilling from the North Island, lovely whiskey. Anthony at Divergence Distilling in Christchurch, he makes some cracking whiskies. Ald's the farm boys down south of Dunedin in Southland. They've got I tasted some of their early stuff before they put it out as matured whiskey. It was delicious. So but it is interesting. Other than Ald's, in New Zealand, a lot of the big players have come with a level of sort of corporate sophistication and investment, like they're big scale. Like Matt Johns at Pokeno, his family owned Tullibardine and big cognac houses in France, and they come with an incredible depth of global understanding of the industry. Scapegrace has got a lot of background from people from Lion Brewing, and and Daniel's a super smart, long time player in the game now. And they've come with the balance sheet, which is really impressive. Whereas Tasmania, literally all the early founders, and it's only been in the last 5 years that a lot of the whiskey going in have been more of a sort of serious corporate commitment versus backyard distillers or craft artisans wanting to make a bit of whiskey in their downtime because they enjoy it. So it is interesting. It'll be interesting with this sort of plateauing, as you call it. At times, it feels like a downturn crash, but um, it'll be interesting to see how everyone muddles our way through these challenging times, because it's a tricky time, that's for sure.
So just got time for one or two more questions for you, and one of them I want to ask is, of course, it just went right out of my head. It was on, oh my goodness, yes. So over your history in the whiskey industry, you've been part of a number of projects. We spoke about that at the beginning and peppered throughout this conversation. But with this project, and I'm speaking specifically of the partnership with Speight and the new distillery there, and this feels like a place where you've settled down. Even if you're not on site in New Zealand necessarily, but it feels like this is the place that you've settled down, as opposed to like building out a distillery, planning it, getting it to fruition, and then next project. What was it about this project that you feel has made you kind of stop and be like, no, I want to be at this project for however long?
I think when we brought in our investment group, so we did a crowdfund and brought in 300 odd investors, and my nature is to start things up, put teams and capital together behind ideas, and then and hopefully get it running up in a really good way, and then look for the next opportunity. But in New Zealand whiskey, there's enough relationships and routes to market, and like we were in 26 states in the US. We pulled out because the margins, after 2.5 years, we just realized the margins there weren't what we could get in Europe and Asia, so we pulled out. But we want to go back in and just pick select markets. So that's a project. That's exciting. It's interesting. A brand clarification and revitalizing. Our new bottling design, which I'm really excited about. The vintage cask project. So there's so many projects in itself in New Zealand whiskey that I don't feel like I need to get too more distracted than I am inherently in my own head. It just ticks a lot of boxes for me, personally. I love the history of Dunedin and Dunedin whiskey. We just found an incredible document about the distillers that came out from Aberdeenshire to help set up and build, a very progressive circular and one-way distillery in Dunedin in 1867. Stuff like that really floats my boat. Now, how we monetize it and commercialize that story into the value of the whiskey is a tricky one, but at least for me, it keeps me reading books at night about all of that. And I do think at the end of the day, whether it's Cyril or Dick Borman, all these early founders, a big thing I feel I'm carrying is this responsibility. I mean, when we bought the business, Warren and Debbie Preston from Mills Reef had busted their gut revitalising the whiskey, rebuilding this incredible old, beautiful old building on the ocean in Oamaru to be the bond store and the cellar door and the bottling hall, and it was a wedding venue, and all these. They did these amazing things, and it's all about honouring the work and what they'd all achieved. Now, sadly, for different reasons, whether it was Seagrams or Fosters or the Prestons, they all ran into awkwardness, and I think we're now in a position to really keep pulling together all of what they couldn't quite complete through. And I think we've done a lot of it already. For example, we've built a new beautiful big distillery. We've got the opportunity for more cellar doors. Really exciting opportunities to keep the brand really front and central of the massive number of visitors to New Zealand every year. I think I have settled down in New Zealand whiskey. It's a nice balance against a few other projects I've got here in Tasmania, which are mainly, again, history and tourism based. So yeah, I mean, I love it, and it's exciting. There's so much upside still. We've just got to clarify where the markets, because what we used to rely on in trade and export are just less reliable now because of this whiskey glut and the discounting, and it's hard to compete with what we have. So we're saying, okay, well, maybe we just get a lot more serious in a few new channels, and that's what we're looking forward to.
Love it, and I'm glad we got to talk at the not conclusion, but drawing to the end of the let's call it the WILLOWBANK era of just, you said you got the 14 casks left, not very much, 1,800 bottles worth or so, but the opening of this new distillery on site with Speight, Dunedin Distillery. So thrilled to talk about this. I'm really looking forward to hopefully tasting some of those. I know you said you're not in the U.S. market right now, but hopefully we'll work on getting something over here. We have some channels. We'll talk about that off air.
Yeah.
But Greg, thank you so much for coming on, talking about these projects. I'm always a fan of anything like New Zealand, Australasia, when it comes to this. That area plus Northern Europe and Scandinavia has been kind of my guilty pleasure through 2025 and entering 2026 as well when it comes to whiskeys. Thrilled to talk about the history and learn more about it. Hang out with me for a couple minutes after we finish recording. There'll be links in the podcast show notes, as always, to where you can follow and follow on social media, follow the podcast, follow Greg and all of his projects as well. And we'll let you know as well when they get hopefully back in the U.S. market. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Like, rate, and subscribe wherever you listen. And I'll see you all next week.
Thanks, Dave.